What would you do if you discovered you had only a few months left to live? Most people would crumble under the weight of grief, or start clinging desperately to the time they had left. But billionaire Hamid didn't feel grief that morning. He felt something much stranger. Curiosity. Curiosity about his family, the people he had built his empire for, the children he had raised in castles of stone, wrapped in wealth and opportunity, the grandchildren who never knew hunger, who wore luxury around their wrists and called it normal. He had given them everything a man could possibly provide: power, privilege, security. But what he never felt from them, not truly, was love. And then came the whisper he overheard in secret, words that sliced his chest open deeper than any disease could. "Don't worry, true love will only come back when he's in the coffin." That sentence wouldn't leave his mind. It haunted him even more than death itself. Because what if it was true? What if his life's legacy was not joy or gratitude, but the greedy anticipation of his funeral? On that cold, cloudy morning, Hamid sat on the edge of his bed with a forged medical report in his trembling hands. A lie, one final test. He would fake a terminal illness. He would give them the chance to prove him wrong, or confirm his darkest fear. And so the news spread like thunder rumbling through the city. Overnight, the once lonely mansion filled with visitors. But the hugs were hollow, the smiles rehearsed. Voices didn't ask about his suffering. They whispered about safes, deeds, and hidden accounts. They weren't there to comfort the man. They were there to circle the fortune. Hamid thought he was prepared for disappointment, but nothing could brace him for the crushing indifference that followed. Because lies reveal truth, and truth is heavier than stone. That morning, under a sky that seemed as heavy as his heart, he gathered the family in the grand living room. The air was thick, muggy, like a warning carried on the wind. His children sat stiffly on the expensive leather couches. The grandchildren hunched in corners, faces glowing from their phones. His wife of 40 years sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, elegant as always. But her silence felt less like love and more like calculation, as if she were waiting for a contract to be read aloud. Hamid stood at the center of the room, his voice trembling, not just from age, but from despair. "I will leave everything," he said slowly, "to whoever loves me at the end. Not at the beginning." The words cracked through the room like a whip. There should have been gasps, tears, protests. Instead, there was silence. Only the ticking of the wall clock, each second pounding like a war drum. He could feel their eyes on him, but none of them were hearing with their hearts. Every sentence he spoke turned invisible in the air, transforming into floating dollar signs above their heads. His wife exchanged a subtle glance with the housekeeper. Not love, not sorrow, strategy. Emotion was dangerous when money was involved, and she knew better than to waste it. Then his eldest son, Obina, stood abruptly, phone already in hand. Within minutes, he returned with a figure Hamid hadn't seen in years. The family lawyer. The very same man Hamid had dismissed for dishonesty, for pressuring him to divide the estate early. Obina forced a smile that never touched his eyes. "It would be best to make things official immediately," he suggested smoothly. "Dad's mind may not be as clear as he thinks." Hamid just stared at him, a stare that carried 50 years of memories, from sleepless nights beside his son's sickbed, to the sacrifices he made silently for his education, to the promises whispered long ago. Betrayal didn't sting the most, it was the indifference. His eldest son looked at him not as father, not even as a man, but as a ledger waiting to be closed. Across the room, his youngest granddaughter pretended to snap photos of him on her phone, but the reflection in the glass revealed the truth. She was cataloging the safes behind him, the shelves where bonds and old gold were hidden. In another corner, a daughter-in-law whispered into her phone, sly and rehearsed, "He's weaker than they said. If he drags it out, he might not even be able to sign." That was the moment Hamid understood the cruelty hidden in plain sight. You don't have to die to be buried. His family had been lowering him into his grave for years, one shallow smile at a time. That night he remained on the porch long after the sun had disappeared, thinking of his childhood, when love was simple, back when a piece of torn bread and a kiss from his mother was worth more than all the houses, all the cars, all the banks he now owned. And for the first time, he was afraid, not of dying, but of leaving nothing behind worth crying for. Days passed, and the house no longer felt like a home. It was an office, a museum, a marketplace. Children came at exact hours, bearing baskets, perfumes, gifts. They stayed an hour, 2 at most, leaving quickly with blurred excuses. Not once did anyone ask if he had slept well or if his heart still ached. They brought shallow hugs, hands on his shoulders, grips that lingered only long enough to check if the safe had been moved. One grandson asked softly, "Grandpa, have you chosen the main heir yet?" Hamid smiled faintly to himself, but his face didn't change. This was the same boy he once told bedtime stories about courage and kindness. Now, he was staring at his grandfather the same way one looks at a briefcase filled with cash. And still, the rehearsal continued. The boldest daughter-in-law arrived one afternoon with a cake, sitting before him with sugar-coated sweetness. As he chewed slowly, she placed her real gift on the table. "You know, it would be easier if you just donated everything now. It avoids confusion later." On the wall nearby hung a photo of his children as children, dirty-faced, barefoot, happy on a broken soccer field. Hamid swallowed the cake but not the sorrow. He thought about all the quiet sacrifices he had made, all the years of hunger, cruelty, and exhaustion so his children could live in opulence. And now, staring into their smiles that concealed knives, he realized they weren't trying to honor him, but to rush his goodbye with papers and ink. The only soul who saw the truth was Egid, his old housekeeper. She never spoke, never interfered, but her eyes carried what no one else's did: sorrow. She watched, scribbling medication times into a notebook, recording visits, but saying nothing. And yet Amide knew. She saw through the facade. She knew love was absent, that greed had rotted the roots of the tree. One of those bleak days, his voice weak, Amide asked, "Read me Psalm 23. The silence that followed was suffocating. None of his children knew it by heart. One grandchild shrugged, pulled out a phone, and read it aloud in a flat, robotic tone, like reciting instructions on a medicine label. When it ended, no one bowed their head. No one whispered, "Amen." Instead, they quickly asked if he had thought about selling the countryside farm, the sacred farm where his own mother was buried. Little by little, the truth strangled the house. The rooms no longer carried love, only suspicion. The paintings were appraised, the books flipped through for hidden papers, the safes measured with tape. No question was about him. He was breathing, aching, speaking, but in their eyes, he was already gone. They weren't waiting for him. They were waiting for the signature that would transfer everything he'd spent his life building. And in those endless days of shallow visits and rehearsed smiles, Hamid began to lose hope that anything could ever change, that he had truly reached the end with no one to carry his memory with affection. What he didn't know was that fate had one more twist prepared, because on a gray afternoon, with dry winds brushing through the halls like whispers of ghosts, the front door creaked. It opened slowly, as though it hadn't in years. And across those cold tiles came footsteps, not hurried, not greedy, not hungry for inheritance, but heavy with the weight of someone arriving far too late. Someone who hadn't been in that house for nearly 20 years. No one announced her. No one was expecting her, but in her eyes she carried something no will, no signature, no safe could ever give: truth. And for the first time in months, Hamid felt it stir deep inside him again. Hope. And maybe that's why it was the only hug Hamid received without warning, without interest, without calculation. Her name was Zedi, the youngest daughter, the only one who didn't grow up among lavish parties and etiquette lessons. Because at 15, after an argument that broke more than just dishes, she left the house, swearing never to return. She lived in another city, in a neighborhood of dirt roads and neighbors who knew each other's names. She earned little, selling sweets at the market and teaching children how to write their names. And no matter how much time had passed, Ao never stopped feeling her absence like a twisted knife in his chest. Zadi didn't hear about the illness through messages. It was the housekeeper who wrote to her, afraid she'd be scolded. A simple letter in shaky handwriting with an almost whispered plea. "Your father is unwell, he needs to see you." She arrived quietly carrying a lunchbox with rice and fish wrapped in a floral cloth. In her other arm, she held an old, faded blue piece of fabric that Amida recognized instantly. It was the same prayer cloth his mother. He used to bless the children before bed. Sadie had kept it since she was little, and now, after nearly 2 decades, she returned with it in her hands, as if coming back to childhood to heal wounds that not even time could erase. When he saw her, Amit didn't know what to say. He just looked at her, his frail body adjusted in the armchair. His eyes welled up, but his mouth found no words. It didn't need to. The silence between them said everything life had never spoken. She knelt at his feet, set the food on the table, and held his hand firmly. "I came," Dad, was all she said. At that moment, Amit wanted to tell her everything was a lie, that his illness was a painful act, meant to measure Theodor's affection. He wanted to explain, to ask for forgiveness, to tell the truth, but fear silenced him. Fear of losing that moment of tenderness, Fear that the pain would resurface. Fear that his daughter might leave again. So he smiled. For the first time since the beginning of the lie, he truly smiled. Not with his lips, but with his heart. The other children took a while to realize she was there. When they did, the sour faces appeared. The veiled questions, the whispers in the halls. "Now she shows up," muttered Obana. "After all these years she comes back now," added his wife with a bitter laugh. But Sadie didn't argue. She wasn't after a will. She didn't want a share of anything. She only wanted to see her father before time, real or fake, took him away. That night she slept in her childhood room. The bed still had the quilt embroidered by her grandmother. The book sat dusty on the shelf, and the window pane was still cracked in the same spot. She looked at everything, not with the eyes of someone returning to the past, but of someone gently rescuing it. She knelt by the bed, placed the prayer cloth over her shoulders, and prayed. She didn't ask for money, for justice, or for repair. She asked for peace, for her father, for the house, for herself. Across the hallway, Ahmed listened. Lying down, heart restless, he let the tears soak the linen pillow. Hecreed like a boy, like a son, like a father. Because in that silent reunion, what hurt most was realizing that the daughter who never cared about his fortune was the only one who brought him comfort. That night marked the beginning of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't healing. It wasn't instant redemption. It was simply truth. And truth in that house had become the rarest thing of all. It was a heavy night, the kind where the wind feels like it carries news that hasn't arrived yet. The porch light flickered like a tired flame, and old Amid lay on the living room couch, covered up to his chest, pretending to sleep. The sound of the clock broke the silence every second, as if marking not just time, but patience. The housekeeper, Yajidi, came and went quietly. She wore worn-out slippers, her back slightly hunched, her expression a mix of fatigue and faith. She had been in that house for 32 years. She knew every inch of it, every habit of her boss, every scar in the family. But that night, she didn't know she would be the target of something that would cut through her soul. It began with a whisper. Aomide could hear it, even with his eyes closed. His wife was speaking with their daughter-in-law in the hallway. The voice was low but sharp. "Did you see the way she treats him? Sleeps in the living room, prays out loud. Looks like she wants a piece of the inheritance, too. That Yid's no fool." The other replied with a giggle. 30 years serving. She probably thinks she's family. Amid felt like a stone had hit his chest. That woman, the same one who had cared for him through fevers, who stayed by his side when he had pneumonia, who still made the porridge with herbs from his childhood, was now being called an opportunist. Asif's loyalty had become suspicious, as if the love of a faithful servant had no worth. At that moment, Ijedi came in with a blanket in her hands. She looked at Ayamida, who kept pretending to sleep, and gently adjusted the blanket. She murmured an old prayer in her native tongue, a prayer for peace, light, and deliverance. Then, with a heavy heart, she pulled a pillow and lay on the couch across from his. She didn't leave. She stayed like someone who protects, like someone who loves without expecting anything in return. Amid cried softly. He didn't want anyone to see, but the linen pillow grew soaked. That pain was deeper than the betrayal of his children. It hurt because Yide had never asked for anything, never demanded recognition. She simply served with dignity, with soul, and now she was being judged for it. In the middle of the night, he woke up to the sound of muffled crying. It was Yidi sitting beside the cold fireplace, hands over her eyes, whispering names. Names of people who had passed. Names our Hamida recognized, old workers of the house, neighbors from the village, his mother. She cried like someone asking permission to keep going, like someone carrying too much weight in the heart. The next morning, no one spoke of what had happened, but the glances were different. His wife avoided him. The daughter-in-law smiled less, and Yajida served breakfast with the same grace, but with eyes that were wet. As Amid sipped the ginger tea she made every morning, he held her hand for a moment. It was brief but firm. He wanted to say thank you. He wanted to say forgive me. But he didn't. Because in that house, true words had become dangerous. In the days that followed, the old man noticed that Jetty spent more time nearby. Not out of interest, but care. She sat with him in silence, read verses from the Quran and the Bible, told stories from when his children were young, and used Toran through the garden. Sometimes she laughed, other times she sighed, and between the lines she said what no one else dared to. You are more than what you own. I knew that if he died that week, he wouldn't just leave behind assets. He would leave pain, questions, and cracks, but he would also leave something else. A name that at least two loyal souls still meant respect. And that for him in that moment was almost redemption. Because in Yajid's heart, he was still Amid, the man. Not the will, not the safe, not the end, just the man. The carefully crafted liar Ahmed had built began to crumble in a way even he hadn't expected. It all started with a strange kind of fatigue, one that didn't go away, not even with the bitter leaf tea Jedi made. First came the loss of appetite, then broken sleep, then the pain in his chest. But he said nothing, thought it was punishment or karma, or just the weight of age mixed with the weight of old wounds. Deep down, Amide no longer knew where the lie ended and the truth began. The game he invented to test others was now testing him in his body, his spirit, his soul. It was Zeddy, the rediscovered daughter, who noticed first. She watched him silently like someone reading a sacred book. She noticed the paler skin, the more distant gaze, the tremble in his hands. On the third sleepless night, she made a decision. She called the doctor quietly without telling her, siblings without making a fuss. It was an old friend from her time working as a caregiver in a public hospital. A humble doctor with no golden titles, but with gentle hands and a listening heart. When the doctor arrived, Aim didn't react. He just looked at Zawadi with those deep-set eyes of someone who no longer fought anything. The checkup happened right there in the room filled with the scent-off herbs and old wood. Blood pressure, heartbeat, eyes, throat. Then a hand on his shoulder and a calm warning. You need tests, real ones. What you're feeling isn't imagined. It was as if the world stopped for a moment. Amide went silent. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to scream. He wanted to ask God if it was irony or mercy. Because now, after so much pretending, something inside him was truly fading, and he didn't know if it was his body or his heart. The news spread quickly. The children came swarming in. His wife took on the air of a widow in rehearsal. The daughters-in-law began making lists, mentally dividing the assets, consulting the lawyer more frequently. But Ami no longer cared. The game had lost its meaning. All he wanted now was for someone to hold his hand, for someone to tell him he could sleep in peace, that he wouldn't be remembered only as the man who had much, but as the father who tried, even if he failed. In the hallways, the murmurs were constant. They talked about expediting procedures, signing powers of attorney, reviewing documents, but no one asked why he was quieter. No one noticed that Amite had stopped speaking, not from weakness, but from exhaustion. Exhaustion from screaming in silence, from being seen as a ticking account. He heard everything from his armchair between Koff's eyes half closed like a man watching his own funeral before it happened. Zeddy once again became the point of light. She sat beside him every morning, brought a damp cloth, wiped his forehead, read proverbs in a soft voice, told stories from childhood. She didn't ask about inheritance. She asked if he had dreamed, if he wanted to hear music, if he remembered his mother's voice. And when he said yes, she closed her eyes with him. As if traveling back in time together, Yajid, despite the side glances, remained steady. She made light soups, mixed healing roots, lit soft incense, tucked prayers along the baseboards of the rooms, as was the custom of her village, and Amid, even without strength, could feel it. He felt there was something beyond the end, something that couldn't be notarized, something that couldn't be locked in a safe dot. It was during this time that he began to question everything. Was it worth it building so much and feeling so little? Is love about giving or about being? Had his children truly learned from him, or had they only inherited his absence? In that stuffy room filled with memories and silences, Amid understood that death doesn't announce itself with a flag. It arrives like Zawadi did, slowly, without promises. And when it comes, what matters isn't the wealth, but the arms around you. Not the accounts, but the eyes that still seethe man behind the fear. That night, as he closed his eyes, Ayamidi didn't think of any will. He thought only of a hand holding his any hand from someone who wasn't there for the paperwork, but for love. The sun rose timidly that morning, as if asking permission to shine on a house where smiles had become rare. The hallways were quiet, but not the peace-filled kind of quiet. It was thessalence of waiting, of tension, of those pauses that come. Just before hard news, Ayam no longer left his room. His body felt lighter, but not from health. It was the weight of the soul dissolving like clay after the rain. Yajidi entered the room with a book in her hand. Not a tray, not medicine. It was the old Bible from shelf, the one he hadn't opened since his mother's funeral. Its edges were yellowed, some pages torn, others marked with dried leaves from a time when he still believed faith could heal wounds money could never reach. She didn't ask for permission. She simply sat beside him, opened the book, and began to read. Her voice was steady but gentle, slow but sure. Blessed is the one who considers the poor. The Lord will deliver him in the day of trouble. It was Psalm 41. Amide was breathing with difficulty, but every word seemed to pierce his chest, both balm and blade. The Lord will protect him and keep him alive, and he will be blessed on the earth. Yajidi stopped, closed the book slowly, met his gaze, and said, "You were never poor, Amid. At least not in your pocket. But today you need mercy, and that can't be bought." Amid felt the weight of it like a slap and an embrace at the same time. He wanted to respond, to argue, but all he could manage was a single tear slipping down his face. The memory hit him hard. His mother, Olamide, kneeling on a dirt floor, holding an aluminum plate, a cloth wrapped around her head, praying that her son would have all he deserves, but also learn to share. He had shared businesses, cars, land, but never his heart. He had kept affection locked inside like a relic. Asif to love was to risk losing, and now lying there fragile, he was the one silently begging for a sliver of tenderness. Jidi went on, not reading from the Bible anymore, but telling stories. She spoke of the day Amiyad returned home young and ambitious, swearing he'd never set foot on the dirt roads of his childhood again. She recalled how he cried in secret at his middle daughter's wedding because she treated him like an obligation, not a father. She remembered how he once yelled at her, the housekeeper, over a towel out of place, but later that night left an envelope with tuition money for her granddaughter without a word. She wasn't there for a paycheck. She was there for memory, for loyalty. Because sometimes what holds human beings together isn't blood, or law, or gratitude. It's a kind of love that doesn't need a name, only presence. Amid looked at her as if seeing for the first time something that had always been there, and in that moment he didn't see a servant. He saw a woman, a witness to his life, the only one who stayed when everyone else treated him like a walking will. She didn't want his house. She didn't want his car. She wanted him not to leave this world with a closed heart. And that, in that moment, was worth more than any inheritance. Later that same day, he asked that the Bible be left by his bed. He touched the worn cover like someone touching something sacred that had been lost to time. And he whispered, almost voiceless, "May God see me." Through her eyes, around the house, the others didn't understand why Yeti walked around with the book in her hands. They thought it was excessive care or fanaticism. But I knew in that simple reading lay the bridge between the man he had pretended to be and the one he could still become, even if only in the final chapter of his life. It was on a muggy morning, the kind where even the palm trees at the gate stood still, that something forgotten by time decided to speak. The heat made everyone irritable, and the tension in the house hung like a heavy fog. You could feel it on your skin, in your breath, in the way everyone avoided eye contact. The children argued more than usual. His wife paced from room to room, as if searching for certainty behind every door. But the deepest truth was still hidden behind a painting in a forgotten corner of the reading room. The painting was of Ayamede's grandfather, a stern man with a hard gaze and steady hands, who had founded the family's first fabric shop. It had always hung there, a symbol of honor and origin. But no one ever looked at it closely until a sudden gust of wind burst the window open, knocking over a smaller frame and making the large portrait sway. Zadi was nearby. She rushed to steady it on the wall, and that's when she noticed something behind it. Carefully, she pulled back the thick fabric and found a yellowed envelope sealed with old wax, tucked between the frame and the wall. It was free of dust, as if time itself had protected it. On the front was a firm signature, Amid. The handwritten date stung 12 years ago, long before the pretending, long before the illnesses real or staged. She brought the envelope to her father, who lay in bed with half-closed eyes. At the sight of the paper, he took a while to react. He reached out slowly as if touching a dangerous memory. He broke the seal with trembling fingers. Read in silence. His breathing grew heavy. His eyes filled. It was the original will, the real one, written when his heart was still full of anger and with a nearly unconscious urge to punish. In that will, Amid left nothing to his children. No assets, no shares, nothing. His entire fortune was to go to small institutions, to projects in poor communities, and part of it would be managed by Y. A final clause, written in bold firm letters, said, "I leave nothing to those who saw me not as a man, but as a vault." Zadie said nothing. She didn't ask, didn't judge. She simply looked at her father with the calm understanding of someone who recognizes the weight of regret in turn found himself at a crossroads. What was harder, to uphold words written in pain or to try rewriting everything through the lens of his own fragility? The lawyer was called. He read the document carefully. The law was clear. If Ami died that week and no new will was registered, this would be the binding one. The family went into a state of alert. The masks dropped completely. The eldest son demanded the will be redone. The wife said it was the product of a sick mind. The middle daughter cried, but her eyes betrayed the calculation. None of them were worried about his soul, only about what he would leave behind. I remained silent. The noise around him grew louder, yelling, bargaining, threats. But within him there was only quiet. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of decision. Because in that envelope was his pain, frozen in time. A piece of history that could no longer be erased, only understood. That night, Shawedi sat with him and asked, "Do you still feel this way?" Ami didn't answer with words. He simply closed his eyes and let a single tear fall. It was his way of saying no. That the man who wrote that will was no longer the same. That the lie had led him to the truth. A truth that hurt, but also set him free. And now, more than inheritance, he wanted to leave behind memory, and if possible, forgiveness, even if late, even if flawed, even if it was just a gesture, but a true one. The night fell heavy, as if time itself had paused to listen to what can only be spoken in the hours when the world sleeps. The house was quiet, but not at peace. It was the kind of silence filled with the echoes of unspoken fights swallowed, words and glances that had been dodged throughout the day. Ahmed couldn't sleep. His body no longer obeyed him, and his mind, restless like a wild horse, kept replaying scenes from the past with cruel clarity. It was Yidi who noticed. She entered the room with light steps, brought a damp cloth to cool his forehead, and asked bluntly, "Should I call someone?" He hesitated. For a moment he thought of saying no, but then a voice barely audible, he murmured, "Call the priest, the old one from the village." She nodded and left with the calm urgency of someone who already understood what that night was asking for. The priest arrived not long after. He wore no cassock, no visible cross, just a plain shirt, linen trousers, worn-out sandals. He entered the room without formality, like someone stepping into the home of an old friend, and sat beside the bed with a sigh that carried both weariness and nostalgia. Amid looked at him with difficulty, but his tired eyes lit up for a moment. They stayed in silence for a while. Then Aomide spoke first. "What if I die, hated by my children, father?" His voice was but thick with an old fear. The kind money was never able to hide. The priest took a deep breath. He didn't answer right away. He picked a book off the shelf, flipped through it absent-mindedly, and only then said, "You'll die known by God. Is that enough?" The question hung in the air like incense. Amid turned his face toward the window. Outside, the full moon lit up the dry branches in the garden. He thought about all he had built, bought, and stored. Thought of the promises he never kept, the letters he never wrote, the birthdays he forgot. He thought of his mother who used to tell him when he was still a boy, "Son, those who plant in concrete only harvest regret." He turned back to the priest. "I don't know if I deserve forgiveness." The priest gave a faint smile, the kind worn by those who've heard that sentence 1,000 times from different mouths, but always with the same tremble in the soul. Forgiveness doesn't come when you deserve it. It comes when you're finally willing to stop pretending you don't need it. In that moment, you might have broke, not like someone collapsing, but like someone letting go of a burden. He cried without shame, without hiding, like a lost child in a marketplace, like a man who finally recognized his own loneliness. He asked for forgiveness, not with rehearsed lines, but with crooked confessions. He spoke of the will, the plan, the shame, the fear of dying without leaving behind anything good beyond titles and properties. The priest listened with patience. He never interrupted. He just nodded from time to time, eyes glistening. When Amide finished, the old priest simply said, "You've done much with your hands, Amide, but now is the time to do something with your heart." They prayed together, not a memorized prayer, but a whisper woven from faith and repentance. And when the priest stood to leave, Ahmed gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Thank you for still seeing me." The priest only placed a hand on his shoulder and replied, "God sees even what you've hidden from yourself." After he left, Ahmed remained there, staring at the ceiling, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Lightness. It wasn't healing. It wasn't a promise. It was the beginning of surrender. Because some wounds can only ease when pride finally grows quiet. And that night, the silence didn't hurt. It held him as if it said, "There's still time. Maybe not to change everything, but not to die in vain." The morning after the priest's visit, Ayamide's house seemed split by an invisible line, not drawn on the floor, but etched in behavior. Half of those present acted like heirs, the other half like guardians of a farewell. The meeting room, once used for contract negotiations and family decisions, had become a silent battlefield. The older children slept there on luxury mattresses surrounded by papers, laptops, and legal consultants. On the other side of the house, the old man's room, now scented with herbs and prayers, welcomed only 3 people, Zoadi, Yajidi, and the youngest grandson, Chinidu. Chinidu was just 7 years old. With wide eyes and a mature kind of quiet, he didn't understand contracts, legal terms, or numbers. But he sensed what the adults had long stopped noticing. He felt that his grandfather was sad even in his sleep. One day he stepped into the room barefoot quietly and approached the bed. Aya Mehmed was sleeping, breathing deeply, like someone dreaming of a place they've never seen. Chinedu touched his hand and whispered, "Grandpa, you're sad even when you sleep." That sentence broke something inside the old man. It was as if a child had translated his entire life into a single line. He said nothing in that moment. He simply opened his eyes slowly and squeezed his grandson's fingers. That small silent gesture was the spark. In that moment, Ami decided it was time to tell the truth. There was no more time for games, no more strength for secrets. He called for Zawadi, asked her to gather everyone, said he wanted to speak, not through lawyers or videos, but with his own voice while he still had it. His daughter obeyed. She gathered the siblings, the daughters-in-law, his wife. Everyone sat in the grand room of the house, the same one where years ago he had announced the will out loud. But now the tone was different. Ahmad entered in a wheelchair. His face was weary, but his eyes, those eyes hardened by time, were clear, almost soft. He asked not to be interrupted, and then he began. He told them everything, the plan, the pretending, the illness that was a lie until it wasn't. He said he did it all to find out who truly loved him, and that the truth hurt him more than any diagnosis ever could. He spoke of the fake embraces, the calculated visits, the hungry eyes that no longer saw a man, just a check waiting to be signed. There was shock, some feigned surprise. Others looked away. Zawadi stood beside him. Yajidi stood behind the chair, hands clasped. Chinedu in the corner clutched a small cloth doll he had brought from the village. Ahmad continued. He said the original will had been found, and that if he passed that week, it would still be legally valid. But he was considering rewriting it, not out of anger, but out of justice. He said he didn't want to reward flatterers, nor punish with vengeance. He only wanted to leave something to those who loved him with truth. The eldest son stood up, tried to interrupt, but was held back by his wife. The middle daughter wept, but there was no more room for excuses. In that moment, Amit wasn't seeking understanding, only one final act of dignity. After he finished, he asked to return to his room. He was tired. As he was wheeled away, he heard the murmurs. He realized that even in the face of truth, some were still focused on the inheritance, but he no longer cared. Because when he looked at Zawadi, at Yajidi, and at Chinedu, he knew he had left behind something greater than houses and cars. He had left a truth and maybe a clean memory. That night, there were no arguments in the house, only silence. Half slept in the meeting room, the other half near the old man, and between sleep and wakefulness Ahmed thought, life doesn't wait, and truth, when it comes, doesn't need applause. It just needs to remain. And he drifted off like that between a house divided and the hope that love even late might still unite what money had torn apart. The day dawned with a different kind of silence. Not the heavy silence of doubt, nor the tense silence of waiting. It was the silence of farewell, the kind that arrives just before the news itself. A soft breeze moved through the halls of the house, and the curtains swayed as if waving goodbye to someone about to depart. The sun, shy, didn't flood the rooms with brightness. It simply touched the walls gently, as if honoring morning before it had officially begun, did not wake up that day. His body, weary and finally at peace, rested like a boat that had reached the end of its voyage. He was serene in bed, his hand still held another Yeats, who had fallen asleep beside the armchair. On the other side, Zawadi sat with her eyes open, praying in silence. Between the two women who had loved him without demand, Ami departed without pain. His final breath brought no drama, no cries. It was gentle, as if he had simply returned to the place he came from. The house took time to realize. The children, still locked in the meeting room, were arguing over clauses and amounts. The daughters-in-law spoke of cars, names on deeds, titles of ownership. But when Yajidi stepped out of the room with tears in her eyes, and Zawadi followed silently, everyone understood. Amidia was gone, and what remained now wasn't wealth. It was the echo of what he had left in each of them. That same day, the lawyer arrived with a flash drive. He said Amite had recorded a video weeks earlier, asking for it to be shown at this wake. The room was prepared, chairs were lined up. The children looked uneasy. The grandchildren sat quietly, Zadi stood firm. Yajedi remained at the back, hands folded over her apron. The video began. Amit appeared, seated, his face already worn, but his eyes alive. "If you're watching this," he began, "it means I'm no longer here. I don't want paper tears or empty speeches. I want you to listen, because what I'm about to say isn't about inheritance. It's about truth." The video lasted 15 minutes. Amamide spoke of his mistakes, of his absences, of the plan he created to test love, of the disappointment, but also of the surprises. He spoke of Zawadi, the daughter who returned with hands full of affection and not a single demand. He spoke of Yede, the woman who cared for him with more love than many children. He spoke of Chinadu, the grandson who gave him back tenderness, with a single sentence. And then came the announcement. The inheritance would not be divided by blood. It would be divided by gestures. A new will, handwritten and registered in the presence of the priest, made it clear each asset would be given not according to surname, but according to heart. The middle daughter received the community school AMI had founded years before, a place where, according to him, she could relearn the value of simplicity. The eldest son inherited the textile factory on the condition that it remain open and employ single mothers from the village. His wife, who lived beside him without truly being with him, was left a modest house in the countryside so she could rediscover silence. But what came next left the room breathless. The pocket watch, Ayamid's oldest symbol of power, was left to Chimu. With a letter, "You saw time in my eyes. May it teach you to love before it's too late." The house where it all happened was given to Yaidi along with a deed that read, "Here you cared, prayed, lived. Now it's yours. May the footsteps that enter it be as gentle as yours." And for Zoadi, he left a notebook filled with handwritten pages telling his story. And at the end, one sentence. "Memory is the only inheritance that can't be stolen. Take care of mine with love." The room was silent, no longer a silence of waiting or calculation. It was a silence of justice, of awe, of a new beginning. Some cried, others didn't know what to do with their hands. But no one left the room the same. Amida departed without a sound. But he left a noise in every heart that no will could silence, because in the end, his legacy was a mirror. It showed each person who they truly were, and gave them not what they wanted, but what they had sown. And that more than gold or land was the greatest legacy he could leave behind. After the funeral, when everyone had said their scripted phrases, when the formal hugs were handed out like business cards, and the flowers began to wilt at the edge of the gate, the house fell silent. A silence that didn't hurt, a silence that hid nothing. It simply allowed everything to finally settle. There was no celebration, no toast, no meeting for the reading of documents, because everyone already knew that farewell video, as direct as it was. Heartfelt had done what's entire life couldn't reveal the truth without masks, without fantasy, without favors. And maybe for the first time, everyone there saw themselves reflected in the mirror of conscience. Obanar, the eldest son, spent days locked in his room. When Heffinali stepped out, he said nothing. He looked at his father's old office and didn't go in. Instead, he took a notebook and wrote something no one read. The middle daughter wept on the phone, saying she didn't expect that, though deep down, she knew. The wife sat in silence on the veer, gazing into the horizon with eyes that seemed to finally understand the emptiness that forms when you live beside someone you never truly knew. But there were 3 people who needed no comfort because they carried within themselves the peace that comes from having lived the truth. Zadi walked the halls of the house with steady steps. She hadn't inherited Safesor estates. She inherited the story. And in the right hands, a story becomes a seed. At night, she would sit in her father's room, read the pages he had left for her, and smile. Not a smile of triumph, but of honor. Chine, wearing the old pocket watch on a blue ribbon around his neck. Walked with the lightness of someone who carries time like a treasure. He touched the cool metal as if it were his grandfather's hand still there. And every now and then he'd say, "Grandpa still lives here," just in silence. Yeti was the last to remain in the house after everyone else had gone. She cleaned each room as she had for the past 30 years. But now, with a different gesture. No longer as a servant, but as a guardian. She walked through the spaces unhurriedly, as if blessing the floors. She slept in the same armchair in the living room, now hers by right and by merit. And when neighbors came to ask if everything was all right, she simply said, "The house is at peace, is gone." But he left his soul here. The inheritance didn't turn into scandal. It became a sigh. No one got what they wanted, but everyone received what they deserved. And that kind of justice, quiet, measured, was more powerful than any courtroom battle because it wasn't written with ink. It was written with soul. Amamide's name didn't become a statue or a street or a building. It became a story told by the lips that still pray for him, by the hands that once cared for him, by the memories that refuse to fade. And those are the kinds of legacies that time cannot destroy. Because love, unlike fortune, cannot be measured. It can only be recognized. And the silence that filled that house was the sound of love at last having one. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave a like, share it with someone who needs to see this, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell to stay updated on the next chapters. Your presence here makes all the